John D. Rockefeller died worth $400 billion in today's money. His name is on universities, museums, and entire city blocks. History remembers him as the man who built the American oil empire. Nobody remembers William Knox Darcy. That is one of the most extraordinary oversights in the history of modern capitalism, because Darcy did for British oil what Rockefeller did for American oil, except Darcy did it harder, in worse conditions, with less support, and at greater personal cost. He negotiated a concession covering 480,000 square miles of Persian desert. He financed 7 years of drilling that everyone around him called madness. He found the oil that the British Empire desperately needed and didn't know it was looking for. Then the institutions arrived, and by the time they were finished, Darcy was a minority shareholder in a company built entirely on his money and his nerve. He died in 1917. His estate was worth £170,000. The company he created, which eventually became BP, has generated revenues exceeding $200 billion in a single year. What happened between those two numbers is a story about oil empire and the oldest trick in the history of big business. By 1908, the world ran on coal. Steam engines, textile mills, naval boilers, all of it fed by the black rock that had powered the Industrial Revolution for a century and a half. Oil existed, certainly. Edwin Drake had punched the first commercial oil well in Pennsylvania back in 1859, and John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil had already turned American crude into a global business. But in Britain, in the Middle East, in Persia, oil was still a rumor, a geological whisper, something locals called naft, and used in thin black trickles to waterproof boats and light lamps in ancient cities. Then Darcy arrived, and nothing was ever the same again. By the time the gusher blew at Masjed Soleiman on May 26, 1908, shooting crude oil 60 feet into the desert sky, the consequences were so vast that they are still unfolding today. BP, one of the 6 largest corporations on Earth, traces its entire existence to that single moment. The geopolitics of the modern Middle East, the strategic calculations that drove 2 world wars, the century-long tension between Western oil companies and Persian and Arab governments, all of it connects, with a directness that is almost uncomfortable, to one Devon-born solicitor's son who had made a fortune in Australian gold and decided at the age of 50 to make another one in Persian oil. But to understand how any of this happened, we need to go back, not to Persia, not to London boardrooms, but to a small town in the Australian outback, where the young William Knox Darcy first learned what it meant to bet everything on ground that might or might not give you something back. Darcy was born in 1849 in Newton Abbot, Devon, a market town pressed between Dartmoor and the sea. His father, William Shurston Darcy, was a solicitor, which placed the family comfortably in the professional middle class, not wealthy by the standards of the English gentry, but educated, respectable, and moderately ambitious. The boy received a solid education and was steered, as so many sons of solicitors were, toward the law. He might have lived and died in quiet Devon obscurity. But in 1866, when William was 17, his father made a decision that would ultimately reshape the energy history of the entire planet, citing health reasons and, more practically, a sense that opportunities were richer in the colonies. The elder Darcy relocated his family to Rockhampton, Queensland, Australia. It was frontier territory, a cattle and mining town on the edge of what Australians called the Never Never, the vast punishing interior of a continent that still felt largely unconquered. Young William trained in law in Rockhampton and established himself as a solicitor. He was disciplined, meticulous, not a gambler by temperament, but a man who understood contracts, concessions, and the law of property with unusual precision. Those skills would matter enormously later, but it was a friendship, not a profession, that would make him rich. In the 1880s, Darcy became closely associated with 3 brothers, Edwin, Thomas, and William Morgan, who had staked a claim to what they believed was a gold-bearing reef near a Queensland town called Mount Morgan. The Morgan brothers had good instincts and terrible finances. Darcy, by contrast, had solid finances and very good instincts about other people's instincts. He invested, he organized, he handled the legal structures and the corporate machinery. The Mount Morgan mine produced over 8 million ounces of gold and was, for a time, the single richest gold mine on Earth. Darcy's share of the proceeds made him, by the standards of 1880s colonial Australia, a genuinely wealthy man. When he returned to England in 1889, he arrived at his London townhouse in Grosvenor Square with somewhere between £700,000 and £1 million in personal assets. In today's terms, that is roughly £80 to £100 million. Enough to live grandly for the rest of his life. Enough, certainly, to never have to gamble again. But here is what most people miss about Darcy. He was not really a man who wanted to rest. He was, beneath the respectable legal exterior, driven by an appetite for large-scale ventures, for the feeling, as one contemporary described it, of putting something truly important into motion. Gold had given him wealth. He wanted something else now, something bigger, something that, in his 51st year, he was about to find in the most unlikely place on Earth. Mount Morgan, 1882. The air smelled of eucalyptus and red dust, a cluster of corrugated iron sheds perched on a Queensland hillside, and below them, barely visible at first, just a reddish outcropping on a slope that most surveyors had already dismissed, was a reef of gold-bearing quartz that would eventually be described as one of the geological wonders of the Southern Hemisphere. William Knox Darcy was 33 years old and had been practicing law in Rockhampton for nearly 15 years. He was not the kind of man who drew attention in a room. Contemporaries describe him as measured, a little reserved, with the careful manner of someone who reads documents twice before signing them. He dressed well, but not showily. He had by this point a solid local reputation and a growing property portfolio. He was, by any sensible measure, comfortable. What changed everything was a conversation, probably over dinner, probably involving several glasses of something strong, with the Morgan brothers. Edwin, Thomas, and William Morgan were not subtle men. They were miners and dreamers, rough-handed, perpetually short of cash, and possessed of a conviction about their Queensland hillside that bordered on the religious. They had been quietly digging for years. They were certain the reef went deep. They just needed capital to prove it. Here's what's interesting. Darcy was not the first person they approached. Several Rockhampton investors had already passed. The early assay results were uneven, promising in places, bafflingly ordinary in others, and the geology was complicated enough to scare off men who preferred their risk to come with clearer odds. Darcy looked at the same reports those men had looked at. He drew different conclusions. What Darcy saw, and this is crucial to understanding every decision he would make for the rest of his life, was not the surface data, but the structural logic beneath it. The Morgan Brothers Reef sat above a volcanic intrusion. Darcy, through his legal and business work, had absorbed enough mining geology to recognize what that meant. The gold wasn't scattered randomly. It was concentrated, probably in extraordinary quantities, at depth. The apparent irregularities in the surface samples were not evidence against the theory. They were, if you read them correctly, evidence for it. He invested. The exact figure he initially committed has been debated by historians, but the most reliable estimates put it at somewhere between £20,000 and £30,000, a very significant sum for a colonial solicitor in 1882. He also provided something arguably more valuable than money: the legal and corporate architecture that would make the enterprise fundable, defensible, and ultimately sellable. He helped organize the Mount Morgan Gold Mining Company, structuring the share register, the concession terms, and the management agreements with a precision that the Morgan brothers, on their own, could never have achieved. The mine opened seriously in 1882. Within 3 years, it was producing at a rate that stunned the Australian financial press. By the late 1880s, Mount Morgan had become something extraordinary, a mine yielding gold at grades and volumes that professional geologists had publicly declared impossible. One commentator, writing in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1887, described the operation as the most remarkable gold property in the world, perhaps in the history of the world. Think about it. In its full productive life, the Mount Morgan mine extracted approximately 259 tons of gold and 387,000 tons of copper. At peak production in the 1880s and early 1890s, it was generating profits that would today be measured in hundreds of millions of pounds annually. Darcy's stake in the company translated, over time, into proceeds that historians generally estimate at somewhere between 700,000 and £1 million by the time he consolidated his holdings and returned to England in 1889. He was 40 years old. He was, by any reasonable calculation, set for life. London in the early 1890s received him the way London has always received men who arrive from the colonies with very large amounts of money, warmly, hungrily, and with a certain barely concealed condescension. Darcy moved into a house at 42 Grosvenor Square, one of the most expensive addresses in the capital, and set about living the life that Victorian prosperity had prepared as a reward for men of his type. He had a country estate in Stanmore, Middlesex. He bred racehorses. He became a figure in the kind of social world where the right dinner invitation mattered more than the right balance sheet. He was comfortable. He was celebrated in a minor way in London financial circles. And he was, though he would not have used this word himself, restless. The problem with making a fortune is that it creates the psychological conditions for wanting to make another one. Mount Morgan had not been a gamble exactly. Darcy had done his analysis, trusted his structural reasoning, and been proven spectacularly correct. The experience had left him with a deep, settled belief in his own judgment about subsurface resources. He knew how to read geological logic when other men were distracted by surface noise. In 1900, that belief was about to find a new and far more consequential outlet. An Armenian businessman named Antoine Kitabji had arrived in London with a proposal. He represented the Persian government, and he was looking for someone with money, nerve, and an appetite for another very large bet on something buried underground. Darcy, by every account, was immediately interested. But what he was about to undertake was not like Mount Morgan in any meaningful sense. In Australia, he had been backing a proven reef in a stable British colony, under British law, with reliable infrastructure and a functioning court system nearby. What Kitabji was offering was different in every possible way. The prize, if it existed at all, was hidden somewhere beneath a desert the size of Western Europe, in a country governed by a decaying dynasty, policed by tribal militias, and coveted by both the British and Russian empires simultaneously. Getting it out of the ground would require infrastructure that did not yet exist. The legal framework was untested, the climate would kill men and equipment alike, and there was, as yet, no definitive proof that any commercially meaningful oil was actually there. Darcy said yes. Tehran, 1901. The city was a contradiction. Ancient minarets rising above muddy bazaars, foreign telegraph wires threading between medieval walls, and at the center of it all, a Shah who knew his empire was dissolving and needed foreign money to hold it together for another few years. Mozaffar ad-Din Shah was not a well man. He had acceded to the Peacock Throne in 1896 following the assassination of his father, and he had spent the intervening years presiding over a country being slowly dismembered by competing imperial interests. Russia held the north, Britain held the south, and the Persian Gulf approaches. Between them, Persia existed in a kind of enforced twilight, nominally sovereign, practically dependent, permanently on the edge of a financial crisis that a good concession sale might delay, if not prevent. The intermediary who brought Darcy into this picture was Antoine Kitabji, a Persian government official of Armenian extraction who had become, in effect, a professional deal broker between Persia and European capital. Kitabji had spent years cultivating contacts in London financial circles, and by 1900 he had fixed on Darcy as the most promising target for a proposition that virtually every established oil company in Europe had already declined. You see, the reason the established companies had passed was not stupidity, it was rational caution. The geological evidence for oil in Persia was indirect at best, based primarily on ancient surface seeps and a survey conducted decades earlier by a British geologist named Henry Walter Abish. The political risks were severe. Russia, which had its own oil interests in nearby Baku, was watching any British commercial advance into Persia with something close to armed hostility. And the infrastructure required to drill, extract, and export oil from a landlocked Persian desert would require capital expenditures that dwarfed anything the speculative oil business of 1900 could easily justify. Darcy, critically, was not an oil company. He was a private individual with a very large amount of money, an unusually high tolerance for geological uncertainty, and no institutional shareholders to answer to. That combination made him, as Kitabji clearly recognized, the perfect mark or depending on your perspective, the perfect pioneer. Negotiations began in late 1900. Darcy sent his own representative to Tehran, a barrister named Alfred Marriott, while he remained in London receiving telegrams and reviewing the legal texts. The Shah's government, desperate for cash, was not in a strong bargaining position, but its ministers were not naive. They had watched what had happened to other countries that had handed foreigners uncontrolled access to natural resources. They structured the concession accordingly. The Darcy Concession, signed on May 28, 1901, was one of the most consequential documents of the 20th century. Its terms were as follows. Darcy received the exclusive right to prospect for, obtain, exploit, develop, render suitable for trade, carry away and sell natural gas, petroleum, asphalt, and ozokerite throughout the whole extent of the Persian Empire, with the exception of 5 northern provinces which were excluded as a concession to Russian sensitivities. The concession ran for 60 years. In return, Darcy agreed to pay the Persian government an upfront cash payment of £20,000, roughly £2 million in today's money, £20,000 in paid-up shares of whatever company he formed, and 16% of annual net profits. 16% of the net profits of what would eventually become one of the richest oil deposits on Earth. The Persian government, which in 1901 could have had no real concept of what it was signing away, received that fraction. The other 84% went to Darcy and, eventually, to his corporate successors. Look, we should be honest about what this arrangement represented in historical context. It was an extractive concession of the most classic colonial type, negotiated between a cash-starved government under imperial pressure and a wealthy private individual from the dominant imperial power in the region. The Shah's ministers understood they were making an unequal deal. They simply had no realistic alternative. Refusing Darcy risked losing the British patronage that was, however imperfect, the only counterweight to Russian encroachment from the north. Darcy, for his part, almost certainly understood the asymmetry. He was a lawyer, but he also believed, genuinely it seems, that bringing capital and technical capacity to Persia would benefit both parties. He was not, by the standards of his time, unusually rapacious. He was a Victorian investor, acting within a Victorian imperial framework, and the framework itself is where the moral weight properly lands. With the concession signed, Darcy moved quickly. He assembled a drilling team, largely recruited from experienced oil workers in Burma and the Scottish shale oil fields, and dispatched them to southwestern Persia in late 1901. The initial base of operations was established at Chia Surk, near the Iranian-Iraqi border, where surface seeps had been observed and where the geological survey data was, relatively speaking, least uncertain. The team arrived to find conditions that no briefing document had adequately conveyed. The terrain was mountainous, the summer temperatures so extreme that drill bits warped and rubber seals dissolved. There were no roads. All equipment had to be transported by mule caravan across passes that became impassable in winter. The nearest town of any size was days away. There were tribal groups in the area who had no particular interest in facilitating foreign drilling operations in their territory, and whose cooperation had to be purchased repeatedly and expensively in advance. The first wells went down slowly. The drilling technology of 1901 was not designed for the rock formations of the Zagros Mountains, formations that were geologically ancient, structurally complex, and in places so hard that cable tool drills simply bounced off them. Darcy's team was consuming equipment, money, and time at rates that alarmed him even from the comfortable distance of Grosvenor Square. By 1902, the initial results at Chia Surk had produced small shows of oil, enough to confirm the geological hypothesis, not enough to justify continued investment on commercial grounds. Darcy faced his first critical decision: escalate or retreat. He escalated. He shifted operations southward toward a region the geologists called the Bakhtiari territory, and he committed additional capital that he was increasingly having to mobilize from assets rather than income. But this wasn't the end of the financial pressure. By 1903, Darcy's personal expenditures on the Persian venture had exceeded £200,000. He had been drilling for 2 years with results that a rational investor, running the numbers cleanly, might have called discouraging. His racehorses were being sold, his social life was contracting, and in London word was getting around that the great DRC gold rush fortune was disappearing into a Persian desert, well by dry well. The summer of 1903 in southwestern Persia was, by any meteorological measure, catastrophic. Temperatures at the drill sites regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Water had to be imported in barrels because the local sources were contaminated or too distant. The men, a mixture of British drillers, locally hired laborers, and Bakhtiari tribesmen, contracted as camp guards and mule drivers, worked in conditions that colonial-era engineering reports describe with a restraint that barely conceals the horror underneath. Darcy's chief drilling superintendent, a Scotsman named George Reynolds, was one of the more remarkable figures in this entire story, and one of the most overlooked. Reynolds had spent years drilling in Burma and had the lean, weather-stripped look of a man who had spent decades in places that tried to kill him. He was not a diplomat. He was not good with paperwork. He was constitutionally incapable of providing the optimistic quarterly summaries that London investors expected. But he could read subsurface geology with a precision that bordered on the uncanny. And he had a quality that the Bakhtiari Desert stripped from most men within a season. He simply did not give up. What most people don't know is that Reynolds was during this period operating almost entirely without reliable communication from Darcy or his agents in London. Telegrams took days. Specific technical instructions were almost impossible to convey across the communication technology of 1903. Reynolds was making drilling decisions about where to sink the next well, how deep to go, when to abandon a site that was consuming resources, based on his own judgment, with no one in proximity who could meaningfully second-guess him. That judgment was repeatedly tested. The wells at Chaya Cirque, having produced only minor shows, were eventually abandoned in 1902. Operations shifted to a new area. Chaya Cirque had been geologically promising but structurally disappointing. Reynolds, working from Abish's old survey data and his own observations of the surface anticlines, the dome-shaped rock formations that trap oil beneath them, identified a region in the Bakhtiari Mountains, closer to the ancient city of Shushtar, as the next target. The logistics of moving a drilling operation in 1903 Persia were, to modern eyes, almost incomprehensible. Every component, drill casing, engine parts, fuel, food, tents, medical supplies, had to travel by sea to the Persian Gulf port of Mohammerah, then by boat up the Karun River, then by mule caravan over mountain passes that in some seasons were simply impassable. A single piece of equipment that broke in the field might take 6 months to replace. A man who fell seriously ill had essentially no medical infrastructure available. 2 of Reynolds' workers died of disease during this period. Several more had to be evacuated with injuries. Through all of this, the money kept flowing out of London. By mid-1903, Darcy had spent approximately £250,000 on the venture and was looking at costs that showed no signs of decreasing. His financial position, which had once seemed impregnable, was now genuinely precarious. He had liquidated significant portions of his investment portfolio to maintain the drilling program. The Stanmore estate was mortgaged. The racehorses were gone. Here's the thing. Darcy could have stopped. There was no contractual obligation preventing him from walking away from the concession, cutting his losses, and retreating to whatever remained of his fortune. Several of his advisors recommended exactly that. One London banker, reviewing the accounts in 1903, reportedly told him that continuing the venture was throwing good money after bad, with a persistence that defies rational analysis, was characteristically laconic. I have looked at the geology. The oil is there. Reynolds has not yet found the right structure. We will continue. That certainty was not bravado. It was in fact based on a sophisticated understanding of what the geological data was actually saying. The surface seeps in the region Darcy was targeting were not random. They were concentrated around specific anticlinal structures, dome-shaped rock formations where oil, migrating upward from source rocks, gets trapped against an impermeable cap. The fact that earlier wells had found only minor shows was not, to Darcy's reading, evidence that the oil was absent. It was evidence that Reynolds had not yet found the right structural trap. This distinction between "the oil is not here" and "we have not yet found where the oil is trapped" is one of the fundamental conceptual divides in petroleum geology. In 1903, it was a distinction that virtually no investor in London was equipped to appreciate. Darcy, was not a trained geologist, but his Mount Morgan experience had given him an intuitive understanding of the difference between surface geology and subsurface structure that most of his contemporaries simply did not have. Meanwhile, the geopolitical pressure was intensifying. Russia had not stopped watching. The St. Petersburg government was making increasingly explicit diplomatic noises about British commercial activities in Persia, and the Shah's court, perpetually playing the two imperial powers against each other, was growing nervous about whether the Darcy concession would survive the next round of Russian diplomatic pressure. In London, the Foreign Office was watching the venture with an interest that it had not yet chosen to make official. Consider this. In 1903, the British Admiralty was still committed to coal-fired warships, but a small group of naval reformers, most prominently a future First Sea Lord named John Fisher, were already arguing that oil represented the future of naval propulsion. Oil-fired engines could generate more power, required fewer stokers, and could be refueled at sea. The strategic implication was clear. Whoever controlled reliable oil supplies would, within a generation, control the seas. In 1903, the Admiralty had no dependable source of oil under British political control anywhere in the world. The Darcy concession, if it produced, would change that entirely. And this is why, by late 1903, the British government was no longer merely an interested observer of Darcy's increasingly desperate financial situation. It was actively looking for a way to keep the concession alive, and if possible, to move it into the hands of an entity over which British institutional interests would have more reliable control than they did over a private Devon-born millionaire slowly running out of cash. The mechanism they found was the Burma Oil Company. Established in 1886 to exploit oil fields in British Burma, Burma Oil was a profitable, professionally managed corporation with strong connections to the British establishment. In early 1904, with the quiet encouragement of the Foreign Office, Burma Oil's directors began negotiations with Darcy about what was diplomatically called a partnership arrangement, but what amounted in practice to a buyout of his controlling interest in exchange for continued drilling finance. Darcy, by this point, was not in a position to be difficult. He needed the money. He signed. In return for a payment and a minority stake in a new joint venture company called the Concession Syndicate, he surrendered operational control of the venture he had conceived, financed, and sustained through 7 years of expensive failure. The man who had staked everything on the Persian desert was now, formally, a junior partner in the enterprise he had created. Reynolds kept drilling. The wells kept going deeper, and Darcy, sitting in a Grosvenor Square that no longer quite belonged to him in the way it once had, waited to find out whether the greatest gamble of his life had been worth it. There is a particular quality to financial ruin when it comes slowly. It is different from sudden catastrophe, different in psychology, in social dynamics, and in the particular kind of exhaustion it produces in the person experiencing it. Sudden ruin is traumatic, but clean. Slow ruin is a prolonged negotiation with hope, a series of small retreats, each of which seems, at the time, like a tactical withdrawal rather than a fundamental collapse. By 1904, Darcy was living inside that process. He was not yet ruined, not technically. He still had the Grosvenor Square house, though heavily mortgaged. He still maintained the appearance of the prosperous Edwardian gentleman, the dinners, the club memberships, the carefully preserved social calendar. But inside the architecture of that appearance, the financial reality was deteriorating in a way that his closest associates could now clearly perceive. The Burma Oil arrangement had provided relief, roughly £20,000 in immediate funding, and an agreement to cover ongoing drilling costs. But it had come at a price that Darcy was only beginning to calculate. He had surrendered the concession's operational control. He was now drawing on a fixed allowance from the concession syndicate rather than directing the enterprise himself. The geological decisions, the drilling locations, the pace of operations, all of it now rested with Burma Oil's technical staff and board. What's interesting is that Darcy's personal correspondence from this period, some of which survives in the BP archive at the University of Warwick, reveals a man who was far more focused on the geological question than on his own financial deterioration. He wrote frequently to Reynolds, pressing for updates on the new drilling sites in the Bakhtiari territory. He maintained a careful private analysis of the geological reports that Reynolds sent back, annotating them in the margins with observations that, retrospectively, show a sophisticated understanding of the anticlinal trapping mechanisms he believed the oil was sitting beneath. Reynolds, meanwhile, was operating under conditions that had, if anything, become more difficult since the Burma oil takeover. The new corporate management was more bureaucratic than D'Arcy's direct personal direction had been. Requisition forms were required for equipment. Cost reports had to be submitted monthly. Reynolds, a man of action who considered paperwork a form of psychological torture, was in an almost continuous state of friction with the London office. The truth was that by 1905, the new wells in the Bakhtiari territory were producing results that were deeply ambiguous. There were shows, small accumulations of oil encountered during drilling that confirmed the geological hypothesis, but nothing that justified the term commercial discovery. The formations were complex, the structure difficult to read from the surface, and the drilling depths required to reach the most promising reservoirs were greater than anything Reynolds' equipment had yet achieved. Look at the numbers, because they tell the story with a brutality that narrative alone cannot quite capture. By the end of 1905, total expenditure on the Persian venture had exceeded £500,000. The current market price of oil, set by the Pennsylvania and Baku fields, where extraction was cheap and infrastructure mature, was low enough that even a significant Persian discovery would require very large volumes to generate acceptable returns on this level of investment. The concessions syndicate was burning through capital with no discovery to show, and Burma Oil's directors were beginning to ask the question that rational investors always eventually ask: how much more? In 1906, the syndicate's board held serious discussions about abandoning the concession entirely. The vote, by one account, came down to a single dissenting director, a man who argued that the geological evidence was too promising to abandon, and that Reynolds' latest analysis of a site called Masjed Soleiman in the Kazakhstan region showed particular promise. The board agreed, with visible reluctance, to fund one more drilling campaign. Reynolds received the instruction to move to Masjed Soleiman, which translates from Persian as Temple of Solomon, in early 1907. The site was different from anything he had previously worked on. The surface geology was spectacular, massive anticlinal ridges of limestone, clearly visible, creating exactly the kind of structural trapping geometry that oil geologists dream about. The seeps in the area were more extensive than anything Reynolds had encountered elsewhere in Persia. And below the surface limestone, the older geological formations that Reynolds believed had been generating and trapping oil for millions of years, were at a depth that his current equipment could just barely reach. He began drilling well number 1 at Masjed Soleiman in January 1908. The ground was hard, the equipment was aging, his workforce was depleted by disease and desertion. And from London he received a telegram in late 1907 that came close to ending the entire enterprise. The concessions syndicate, reviewing its financial position, had decided to suspend operations. Reynolds was instructed to conclude current drilling at depth 1,600 feet and prepare for withdrawal. Reynolds did not respond immediately. He read the telegram, he looked at the geological logs from the last few hundred feet of drilling, and then he made a decision that, with historical hindsight, looks almost impossibly consequential. He kept drilling. He would later explain this decision, partially with the laconic brevity of a man who distrusted excessive explanation, by saying that the gas shows in the final logs indicated a reservoir very close to the current drill depth. To stop now, he reportedly told his site manager, would be like stopping 10 feet from a door. He continued to 1,180 feet, then 1,400 feet, the drill cutting through ancient limestone, while London waited impatiently for news of the retreat that Reynolds had not yet begun. D'Arcy, by this point, had almost no formal role in the decision-making. He was a minority shareholder in a syndicate controlled by Burma Oil, which was itself responding to a board that was losing confidence in the entire venture. His fortune was substantially depleted. His health, strained by years of financial anxiety and the social erosion that comes with visible decline, was poor. He was 59 years old, and the venture that had consumed his wealth and his decade was, by every institutional measure, on the edge of termination. And then, in the pre-dawn hours of May 26, 1908, At a depth of 1,180 feet below the Masjed Soleiman plateau, the drill encountered something different. The gas pressure built first, a rumbling in the drill string that the night crew recognized as something they had never felt before. Then the casing began to shake. Then, with a sound that witnesses described variously as a cannon shot, a thunderclap, and the earth itself tearing open, a column of dark crude oil erupted from the wellhead and shot 60 feet into the Persian sky. It rained oil on Masjed Soleiman for 3 days. George Reynolds stood in the oily rain and did not, by any account, celebrate. The men around him, drillers, laborers, guards, were shouting, embracing, firing rifles into the air in the local tradition of marking extraordinary events. Reynolds reportedly watched the column of oil with the expression of a man completing a calculation he had been working on for 7 years. The telegram he sent to London that morning was characteristically understated. Oil struck Masjed Soleiman. Stop Gusher. Stop Reynolds. 9 words for an event that would reshape the geopolitics of the 20th century. In London, the reaction was anything but understated. The Burma Oil Board, which had weeks earlier been discussing the final abandonment of the concession, received Reynolds' telegram on May 26, 1908. Within hours, shares in the concession syndicate had begun to move. Within days, the British government, which had been monitoring the venture through the Foreign Office and Admiralty with increasing strategic anxiety, was in direct communication with Burma Oil's directors about the implications of what had been found. What had been found, it quickly became clear, was not merely a commercial oil field, it was a reservoir of extraordinary size and quality. The initial flow from well No. 1 at Masjed Soleiman was estimated at between 10,000 and 15,000 barrels per day, an output that would have ranked it among the most productive wells in the entire world at that time. The oil itself was of excellent quality, light, with low sulfur content, highly suitable for the fuel oil that the Royal Navy was beginning to covet. Well number 2, drilled nearby within weeks of the first discovery, confirmed that the initial gusher was not an anomaly. It was part of a vast accumulation. Later surveys would establish that the Masjed Soleiman field sat above a petroleum system of almost continental scale, extending across thousands of square kilometers of the Zagros geological province and containing reserves that in total would be measured not in millions but in billions of barrels. Let me put this in perspective. The Zagros oil province, the broader geological region that Darcy's concession had first penetrated, would go on to produce oil for more than a century. The fields discovered in Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait that ultimately trace back to the geological province opened by the Masjed Soleiman discovery collectively represent perhaps 10% of all the oil ever extracted from the earth. One man's bet, financed by Australian gold, had located the entrance to one of the most significant concentrations of fossil fuel in the history of industrial civilization. Darcy learned of the discovery at his home in London. The precise details of his reaction are not recorded. What we know is that he immediately recognized the vindication of everything he had argued for 7 years: the geological thesis, Reynolds's judgment, his own determination to continue past the point that rational analysis had counseled retreat. His instinct had been right. He had been right in the way that people are very rarely right about anything, comprehensively, definitively, expensively right. But here is the tragedy at the center of this story. And it is a tragedy of a particularly modern type, familiar to anyone who has watched a founder lose control of what they built. Darcy was right about the oil. He was not in a position to benefit from being right. The Burma Oil Company moved with remarkable speed after the discovery. Within months, Burma Oil's directors, with explicit encouragement and financial participation from the British government, had established a new company to exploit the Persian oil finds. That company, incorporated on April 14, 1909, was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Its share capital was £2 million. Its shareholders included Burma Oil, various City of London institutions, and a scattering of private investors. William Knox Darcy received shares in Anglo-Persian worth approximately £895,000 at the time of the company's formation, a substantial sum that represented, on paper, a significant portion of the original value of what he had created. He was also given a seat on the board, which he accepted. What he was not given was control. Anglo-Persian was a corporate entity organized from the start to serve British strategic interests as much as private financial ones. Its board was dominated by Burma oil directors and city figures with close ties to the government. Darcy, the man whose money and conviction had produced the discovery, occupied the ceremonial position of founding shareholder. He attended board meetings. He was treated with respect. He had no operational authority. The truth was, and this is something that Anglo-Persian's early internal correspondence makes unmistakably clear, that the institutional players who had taken over the venture in 1904 had always regarded Darcy as the financing mechanism for an asset they intended to control once it proved up. His commitment to the project had been essential when no institution would fund it. Once the oil was found, his role was complete. Reynolds fared worse. George Reynolds, the man who had physically drilled the wells, made the on-the-ground geological decisions, defied the London board's instructions to stop, and personally overseen the discovery well, was dismissed by Anglo-Persian in 1911. The reason given was personality conflicts with management. No bonus was paid. No recognition ceremony was held. Reynolds returned to England and spent his later years in relative obscurity, occasionally consulted by oil companies who knew his professional reputation, largely ignored by the corporate structure that existed because of his work. He died in 1925. The obituaries were brief. Darcy at least had his shares, which appreciated considerably as Anglo-Persian grew. But the fortune he held in 1909 was, in real terms, a fraction of what it would have been had he retained controlling interest through the discovery. The corporate mechanism had done its work with efficiency. Meanwhile, the strategic implications of the discovery were unfolding at a pace that made the financial details feel almost peripheral. In 1912, a first-year Lord of the Admiralty named Winston Churchill commissioned a formal report on the feasibility of converting the Royal Navy from coal to oil propulsion. The report was unambiguous. Oil offered decisive tactical and strategic advantages. The problem, as Churchill framed it in subsequent cabinet papers, was supply security. The only commercially proven oil field under British political influence was Anglo-Persian's Masjed Soleiman operation in Persia. And Persia, as everyone in Whitehall knew, was politically unstable. Churchill's solution, one of the most consequential government decisions of the 20th century, was to make the British government itself a shareholder in Anglo-Persian. In 1914, just weeks before the outbreak of war, Parliament approved the purchase of a 51% controlling stake in Anglo-Persian at a cost of £2.2 million. The British government was now formally in the oil business. And the oil business was built on a concession that a Devon solicitor's son had bought for £40,000 and 7 years of his life. August 1914. The guns were just beginning when the ships started to move. The Royal Navy that steamed out of British ports in the first weeks of the First World War was a different instrument from the one that had ruled the seas 20 years earlier. The dreadnought battleships, the great grey steel fortresses that defined naval power in the pre-war decade, were oil-fired. Their turbines consumed enormous quantities of fuel oil, at rates that made the logistics of fleet operations a function, above all, of fuel supply. Every mile steamed, every shell fired from the giant naval guns, every hour of patrol in the North Sea, all of it ran on oil. And a significant portion of that oil came from a field in southwestern Persia that William Knox Darcy had financed into existence 13 years earlier. Anglo-Persian's Abadan refinery, built on an island at the mouth of the Shat al-Arab waterway, completed in 1913, was at the time of its opening the largest oil refinery in the world. Its capacity was designed not merely for commercial oil production, but for the strategic requirements of a navy that had committed, at Churchill's insistence, to oil propulsion. The pipelines connecting Abadan to the Masjed Soleiman and Ahvaz fields stretched hundreds of miles across the Khuzestan plain, an engineering achievement that had required years of work and capital expenditure that dwarfed anything Darcy had imagined in 1901. What most people don't know is how close the whole operation came to being destroyed in the first months of the war. The Ottoman Empire, which entered the conflict on the German side in late October 1914, shared a border with the Khuzestan oil fields. Ottoman and German agents were actively working to subvert the Abadan operation, blowing up pipelines, inciting tribal groups in the area to attack Anglo-Persian installations, and encouraging the Persian government to repudiate the Darcy concession on the grounds of wartime necessity. The British response was swift and, by the standards of international law, breathtakingly direct. Within weeks of the Ottoman entry into the war, a British Indian Army force landed at Basra and began a campaign to secure the oil-producing region of Khuzestan. The Mesopotamia campaign, which would eventually become one of the longest and most costly campaigns of the war, involving over 900,000 Allied troops and producing casualties measured in the hundreds of thousands, had at its strategic core a mission of protecting the Anglo-Persian oil installations. The oil, in other words, was already reshaping military strategy and costing lives. What Darcy had found was not merely a commercial deposit, it was a strategic asset of the First Order, and the British Empire would prove willing to spend enormous quantities of blood and treasure to protect it. Throughout the war years, Anglo-Persian's production ramped up to meet naval demand. The company's revenues grew dramatically. The share price appreciated. The British government's 51% stake, purchased for £2.2 million in 1914, was generating returns that the Treasury found deeply satisfying. Darcy watched all of this from an increasing distance. By 1915, he was 66 years old and in declining health. The board seat he held at Anglo-Persian was increasingly ceremonial. He attended meetings less frequently. His correspondence from this period shows a man who followed the company's progress with genuine interest, but who had largely accepted his own marginalization with a stoicism that seems, in retrospect, either admirable or heartbreaking depending on your perspective. The precise state of his finances in the later war years is difficult to establish with certainty. The shares he received in 1909 had appreciated, but Anglo-Persian did not pay substantial dividends in its early years, preferring to reinvest in infrastructure. Darcy had other assets, the Grosvenor Square house, some property holdings, but the great fortune of the Mount Morgan years had been largely consumed by the Persian venture. He was not destitute, but he was nowhere near as wealthy as his foundational role in the company might have suggested he should be. Here's the thing that makes this particular story so resonant across historical time. It is not, at its core, about oil. It is about the relationship between private risk and institutional reward, about the mechanism by which the people who take on genuine uncertainty at the beginning of transformative ventures are routinely separated from the fruits of that uncertainty by the institutional players who arrive after the uncertainty has been resolved. Darcy's situation in 1915 was not unusual. It was, in fact, the standard template. The visionary founder who bet everything on an unproven idea was bought out when the money ran low, and then watched from a minority position as the institutions that had acquired his vision at a discount transformed it into something worth infinitely more. What made his case distinctive was the scale, the sheer magnitude of what had been found, and the degree to which the global consequences of that discovery were already visible. Meanwhile, Anglo-Persian was transforming itself from a frontier oil producer into a vertically integrated energy corporation. By the middle of the war, it operated the refinery at Abadan, a network of pipelines across Khuzestan, a fleet of oil tankers, and distribution networks in Britain and India. Its technical staff was expanding rapidly, drawing on engineers from the British petroleum and chemical industries. It was, in corporate terms, a thoroughly modern industrial enterprise, built on a concession negotiated by one man in a Tehran palace in 1901. The war also had a second-order effect that would shape Anglo-Persian's future for decades. It demonstrated definitively that oil was not merely an energy commodity, it was a military strategic resource of the highest order. Nations without reliable oil supplies were tactically handicapped. Nations with control over oil could project power in ways that coal-fired rivals could not match. This lesson, learned in the Dardanelles, in the Arabian Desert, in the failed Mesopotamian campaign, drove the post-war scramble for oil concessions that would, within a decade, create the modern Middle Eastern oil industry. Darcy had not set out to change the world. He had set out to make a profit on a geological hypothesis. But by the time the war ended in 1918, the world had been changed anyway, by the oil he had found, the company he had created, and the strategic reality that his private gamble had inadvertently constructed. There is a document in the BP archive at the University of Warwick that almost no one outside the company's official historians has read. It is a set of internal accounting records from 1917 and 1918, detailing the personal financial position of certain founding shareholders of Anglo-Persian. The relevant entries concerning Darcy are spare, precise, and if you understand what they represent, quietly devastating. By 1917, Darcy's Anglo-Persian shareholding had been substantially diluted by subsequent share issuances. His original £895,000 in shares, already a fraction of the concession's underlying value, had been eroded by the company's repeated capital raises to fund infrastructure expansion. His dividend income was modest. His other investments had not recovered from the years of Persian expenditure. The Grosvenor Square house had been remortgaged. He was not technically bankrupt, but the trajectory was clear. The man who had created one of the most valuable industrial concessions in history was, in his final years, managing a financial decline that the company he had founded showed no institutional interest in reversing. What's interesting is that there is no evidence of bitterness in Darcy's surviving correspondence. The letters from his later years, collected in the BP archive and in private collections, show a man who remained genuinely engaged with Anglo-Persian's commercial progress, who asked intelligent questions about the company's geological program in Persia, and who maintained the polite collegiality of a former insider without apparent resentment. Whether this reflected genuine equanimity or simply the trained stoicism of a man from a certain generation and class is impossible to determine from the documentary record. What we do know is that by 1917, Anglo-Persian had begun generating very substantial profits. The war had driven oil prices up significantly. The Abadan refinery was operating at capacity. The company's revenues for fiscal year 91617 were more than triple what they had been in 1913. The shareholders who had bought in at the company's formation, the Burma Oil Group, the city institutions, the government itself, were beginning to see returns that would eventually make Anglo-Persian one of the most profitable corporations in British history. The truth, uncomfortable but unavoidable, is that Anglo-Persian's corporate structure had been designed, whether consciously or simply as a result of the institutional dynamics at play, to concentrate the upside of Darcy's discovery in the hands of the institutional players who had taken over operational control, rather than in the hands of the man who had taken the original risk. There is a precedent for this pattern that business historians have identified in countless other industries across the same era. The individuals who fund the pioneering phase of a transformative venture, the phase when the outcome is genuinely uncertain, are rarely the individuals who capture the majority of the ultimate value created. That value accumulates instead in the hands of the professional managers, institutional investors, and corporate structures that arrive once the uncertainty has been resolved. Darcy's story is, in this sense, not uniquely unfortunate. It is archetypal. What made his situation distinctive was its sheer scale. The gap between what Darcy received and what the concession he created was worth, even by 1917, let alone by the time Anglo-Persian became British Petroleum and generated a century of profits, was not a matter of thousands or even millions of pounds. It was, measured in any consistent unit across time, an extraordinary misalignment between risk and reward. There is also the question of what the British government's behavior in this story tells us about the relationship between private enterprise and imperial strategy in the Edwardian era. The government did not steal the concession from Darcy, not directly, not technically, but the process by which the Foreign Office encouraged Burma Oil to take over the floundering venture, and then subsequently moved to acquire a controlling government stake in the resulting company, was a process that consistently prioritized British strategic interests over Darcy's private financial ones. This was not regarded at the time as remotely controversial. The idea that a private individual's financial interests might properly take precedence over the strategic requirements of the empire was not a concept that had wide purchase in Edwardian Britain. Darcy himself, operating within the value system of his class and time, does not appear to have challenged this arrangement. He accepted the institutional logic of what had happened, collected his shares, sat on his board, and attended his meetings. But the ledger tells a story that the polite surface of Edwardian corporate life obscures. In 1917, while the company he had created was generating profits of historic magnitude, Darcy was managing a personal financial situation that his own solicitors described in private correspondence as a source of significant concern. He was dependent on the modest dividend income from a shareholding that had been diluted multiple times. He had no other substantial income. His assets were declining. He died on May 1st, 1917. He was 67 years old. The cause of death was recorded as cardiac failure. Not surprising, given the years of financial and physical strain. His estate, when probated, showed net assets of approximately £170,000, a comfortable middle-class inheritance by the standards of 1917, a fraction, by any meaningful calculation, a tiny fraction of what the concession he had created was already worth. The Times ran a brief obituary on May 2. It noted his role in the Persian oil discovery and expressed condolences to his family. It did not, in the way of Times obituaries of that era, dwell on uncomfortable economic realities. Anglo-Persian Oil Company became Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1935, a name change that reflected the new Persian government's insistence on using the country's updated official name, but changed nothing about the fundamental relationship. The company remained a British-controlled corporation extracting Iranian oil under the terms, now long outdated, of a concession that had given the Iranian state 16% of net profits. That arrangement, rooted ultimately in the 1901 Darcy concession, became one of the central grievances of Iranian nationalism in the post-war decades. The argument was straightforward and, stripped of the geopolitical complexity that surrounded it, essentially correct. A concession negotiated between a desperate Shah's government and a private investor under British imperial pressure was providing Iranian citizens with a tiny fraction of the wealth produced by their own country's natural resources. In 1951, Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Anglo-Iranian. It was the most significant act of natural resource nationalism in the post-war world, a direct confrontation with the legacy of Darcy's original concession and with the century of extractive logic that concession had established. The British government's response, coordinated with the CIA, was a coup. In 1953, Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah was restored. Anglo-Iranian, renamed British Petroleum in 1954, regained access to Iranian oil under new consortium arrangements. The 1953 Iranian coup remains one of the defining events in the history of Western Middle Eastern relations, generating a legacy of distrust and anti-Western sentiment that has directly shaped Iranian politics for 7 decades. Consider this. Every element of that sequence, the nationalization, the coup, the Shah's restoration, the revolution that ultimately swept the Shah away in 1979, and the hostile relationship between Iran and the Western powers that has persisted ever since, traces back, through an unbroken chain of cause and effect, to a document signed in Tehran in May 1901 by a British investor and a Persian minister. British Petroleum became BP in 2001, dropping the national designation as part of a rebranding exercise that reflected the company's genuine transformation into a multinational corporation with shareholders, operations, and employees distributed across the globe. BP is today one of the largest corporations on Earth, with revenues in most years exceeding $200 billion. Its history section on the corporate website acknowledges Darcy's role in measured, respectful terms. There is a brief biography, a photograph, an acknowledgement that his concession was the foundation on which the company was built. There is no Darcy Museum. There is no major monument. In Newton Abbot, the Devon market town where he was born, there is a modest heritage plaque on a wall near the town centre. It mentions his birth and his role in the Persian oil discovery. Most residents, by all accounts, are unaware of it. George Reynolds has no memorial anywhere. The 16% net profit clause in the original Darcy concession, the fraction the Persian state received while Darcy and his corporate successors took the rest, is a number that has never been forgotten in Iran. It appears in Iranian school textbooks as evidence of the colonial exploitation that the 1979 Islamic Revolution was, in part, a response to. The figure is accurate. The exploitation was real, and its roots run directly to the document that Darcy signed in a Tehran palace on a morning in late May 1901. Darcy's legacy is therefore genuinely complex, perhaps more complex than almost any other figure in the history of the modern energy industry. He was, in his personal conduct, not a cruel or cynical man. The evidence suggests he believed, probably sincerely, that bringing capital and petroleum technology to Persia would benefit both countries. He was not an imperialist ideologue. He was a businessman operating within an imperial system, and the distinction matters even if its moral weight is limited. At the same time, the system he operated within produced consequences that were, for millions of Iranians across the following century, genuinely harmful. The underpricing of their national resources, the political instability that came with foreign domination of their most significant economic asset, the 1953 coup, and its generational consequences. All of it connects to that original concession. When you step back and look at the full picture, the question Darcy's story poses is not really about one man. It is about what happens when private risk-taking, imperial power, and natural resources intersect, and who bears the costs of that intersection over time. Darcy bore some of the costs personally, in financial terms. Iran bore far larger ones, in political and economic terms. The companies and governments that extracted the most value from the system he created bore the fewest costs of all. That is a pattern that has repeated itself, with variations across the entire history of the global oil industry. Understanding where it started, in a Queensland mining deal, a London drawing room, a Tehran palace, and a Persian desert that finally gave up its secret on a morning in May 1908, is essential to understanding why the world's relationship with oil has been, from the beginning, inseparable from questions of power, inequality, and the persistent gap between those who take risks and those who ultimately collect the rewards. So we've seen how a Devon solicitor's son, enriched by Australian gold and driven by a geological conviction that bordered on the obsessive, staked his entire fortune on a concession in a Persian desert and was proven right in the most dramatic way imaginable, only to watch the fruits of his extraordinary gamble concentrated in the hands of institutions that arrived after the hard work was done. Today, more than a century after the Masjed Soleiman gusher, the legacy of what Darcy set in motion remains embedded in the structure of the modern world, in ways that are easy to overlook precisely because they have become so fundamental. BP, with assets exceeding $280 billion, operations in 30 countries, and a history that includes the catastrophic Deepwater Horizon spill of 2010 and the company's subsequent reinvention as a would-be clean energy giant, is, for better or worse, one of the most consequential corporations in human history. Its origin story begins with Darcy. The modern Middle East's oil states, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, exist in political and economic forms shaped decisively by the concession model that Darcy's 1901 agreement established. The fights over those concessions, the nationalizations, the coups, the sanctions regimes, the wars, all of it runs on rails that were laid in significant part by one man's decision to drill in a desert that everyone else had already given up on. When you step back and look at the full picture, the real lesson here isn't simply that Darcy found oil, it's that the discovery of oil beneath a foreign territory, under a concession structure designed by and for imperial power, created a set of economic and political distortions that no subsequent arrangement has fully corrected. The 16% clause didn't just undervalue Persian oil. It created a century-long grievance that shaped the politics of one of the world's most strategically significant countries, and that shapes them still. There is also a story here about the economics of innovation and risk. Darcy was, in the language of modern venture capitalism, the original founder, the person who identified the opportunity, committed the capital, absorbed the early failures, and persisted past the point where rational analysis suggested giving up. The institutional players who came in later, Burma Oil, the British government, the city financiers, were in the same language. The late-stage investors who arrived after the de-risking was largely complete, captured the controlling economics, and rebranded the asset as their own creation. This dynamic, pioneering risk without pioneering reward, is not an anomaly in the history of resource extraction. It is the standard template. Understanding it requires looking not at individual character, but at institutional structure, at the legal frameworks, corporate mechanisms, and imperial political arrangements that determine who captures value from transformative discoveries. Darcy was not outmaneuvered by smarter people. He was outmaneuvered by a system that was working as designed. And George Reynolds, the man who actually drilled the well, who defied direct instructions from London to stop, who stood in the oily rain on that Persian morning in May 1908, received essentially nothing. No bonus, no recognition, no corporate acknowledgement of the fact that without his geological judgment and his stubborn refusal to comply with a bureaucratic stop order, the discovery might have come years later, or not at all. History treats Reynolds as a footnote. The corporate entity his work created treats him as an operational detail. Whether we like it or not, the world runs on oil that William Knox D'Arcy found, and the geopolitical conflicts, environmental consequences, and economic inequalities associated with that oil are in some meaningful sense an inheritance of the decisions he made, the concession he signed, and the corporate structure that emerged from his extraordinary desert gamble. So the question remains, when we think about the pioneers who took the risks that built the modern world, the people who bet their fortunes and their health on geological hunches in unknown deserts, what do we actually owe them? And more importantly, what do we owe the people on whose land and beneath whose feet those discoveries were found? D'Arcy got a share. Iran got 16% of the net profits. For 60 years, the world got a century of oil. Who got the best deal, and who is still paying for it? That is a question that the modern energy transition has not yet answered. If you made it this far, if you sat through the Australian gold mines, the Persian desert, the 7 years of dry wells, and the corporate maneuvering that followed the greatest oil discovery of the Edwardian era, leave a comment with the word Masjed. That's our signal that you are the kind of person who watches for the full story rather than just the highlight reel. If this kind of deep dive history, the stories that shape the modern world in ways that most textbooks never get to, is what you come here for, then subscribing is the single most useful thing you can do. We put out this kind of documentary-length research every 2 weeks. Each one is built from primary sources, archival material, and the kind of financial and geological detail that most history channels leave out. If you enjoyed this story, you will want to watch our documentary on Marcus Samuel and the founding of Shell, the other half of what became the British oil duopoly, and a story that involves a seashell trading business, a Suez Canal negotiation, and a boardroom battle that nearly destroyed both companies. It is linked on screen now and in the description below. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.